Hi everyone, good morning. Welcome to Learn with Lorna, episode 193, where we are looking at historic police personnel records. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn, as you will know if you've watched all the other 192 episodes, and I am the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. We have 4 archive centres in the Highlands of Scotland, in Inverness, Wick, Fort William and Portree, where we look after historic records and current records also connected to the Highlands of Scotland. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland's a charity registered in Scotland, and there is no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, which I know that some of you already have, then we really are grateful for that. So please know that it is appreciated. So yes, welcome back to a live one after a couple of weeks of pre-recorded. Yes, John, I'm kind of recovered from my walk. Swings and roundabouts, I would say there, but that's a story for another day. So yes, welcome back to being live again, but I'm not sure quite how long it will be live for because October is absolutely busy. I've got so many events on, multiple events a day through October, so I think another one might have to be pre-recorded at the end of the month, but we'll see. So this one, we are revisiting a subject that is always of interest, always popular, looking at police records. I've done several episodes on this subject over the last few years, pulling on this large collection of Northern Constabulary, I'll come back to that terminology, police records that we hold across all 4 of our archive centres. I've often looked at it from a geographical perspective, so I've done episodes, for instance, 158 was on the Caithness police records, 168 was on Lochaber, 172 was on Ross and Cromarty police records. And this week I'm going to be doing it a little bit differently, that I'm looking at one specific record type within this extensive record collection. So we're going to be looking at police personnel records specifically. And I'm going to start by sharing with you an extract from the Scottish Archive Network knowledge base, which summarises what police personnel records are and the sort of information that might be found in them. Now, I know I've mentioned the SCAN knowledge base a lot. It's a very useful resource. I would recommend that you have a look at it, but often it means that they will summarise what I would summarise, so it's a quick way for me to tell you the facts of a record series. So here is the overview of that subject. Police forces for Scottish counties, cities and towns were set up in the 19th century. In 1975, most of these were then abolished when 8 regional forces were set up, which of course is where I'm talking about Northern Constabulary. All of those were then subsequently amalgamated into Police Scotland. In the 19th century, the policy of many forces was to recruit policemen from outside the borough or county served by the force. So, for instance, Glasgow City Constabulary, Scotland's largest police force in the 19th century, recruited a large number of its constables from the Highlands and from the Islands and from Ireland. 19th century forces had a very high turnover, in part due to frequent dismissals for offences relating to alcohol or assault, and also possibly due to the relatively low wages. And that's interesting, that summary from a Scotland-wide perspective, that they're seeing high turnover of staff, because I'll challenge that with something in a second. Police personnel registers are an exceptionally good form of staff record on several counts. Firstly, it is rare to find staff registers for any public or private body dating back as far as some police registers. Secondly, from the mid-19th century onwards, they typically contain a great deal of personal information. Registers from the first half of the 19th century are rare, and many of those which do survive are rudimentary forms of appointment books or registers of dismissal or disciplinary action. But in the second half of the 19th century, police personnel registers adopted a more standard format. This was due in part to the size and sophistication of police forces, but probably more to the creation and changes of the police pension, especially after the Police Scotland Act 1890 and various laws thereafter. So they're saying that you can get a huge amount, in a nutshell, a huge amount of personal information from within these, particularly from the mid-1800s onwards. A 1904 police manual for Lanarkshire, held at Glasgow City Archives, records that the constable's register and the entries therein, authenticated by the signature or initials of the chief constables, shall be used as evidence of the service and conduct of any member of the force. So that's the purpose. They're aimed to record how long someone has served, what their behaviour has been like, whether they've done any kind of meritorious acts or whether they've had any misconduct, and what their if they're going on special leave for special purposes. All those kind of things are recorded in there. So then it goes on to describe the content. For each policeman or policewoman, the registers may contain their name, age joining, former occupation, marital status, number of children, domestic address, sometimes, place of birth, sometimes, date of appointment, and then any of those subsequent changes in, like I say, things that are particularly meritorious or particularly negative. I'm obviously going to talk about ones that we hold in Highland, but just from a Scotland-wide perspective, SCAN notes, police personnel registers are the primary source of information on the careers of police personnel and are therefore most used by police historians, genealogists, anyone who knows or suspects that their ancestors may have been in a Scottish police force, and those who have acquired the medal, badge, equipment or some other artefact of someone associated with the police. However, police personnel registers also have much greater potential than those investigating individual officers. Because the policy of many forces was to recruit from outside their borough or county, you may find them as a great source of movement within the country. So quite often people will, it may be that someone's ancestor has served in a police force for a short period of time in the area they weren't expecting. So you can find all sorts of information. So that's an overview really of what these records are. They're closed for 75 years, so that's just data protection because they're staffing records. So currently you would get access to, famously my maths is terrible, around about 1950. Yeah. Okay, so that's a quick overview, but let's start to look at the individual service records of some members of the police forces across the Highlands. And I'm going to start in the Inverness-shire Ross and Cromarty record and defaulters book. That's the name for the personnel register. Alexander McVicker was 21 years old when he joined the constabulary on the 20th of December 1876. He was a native of Inverness-shire and he was appointed by the Chief Constable William Murray. It records him as being 5 foot 9 1/4 inches. All these quarter inches are really important in these records. And he had blue eyes and auburn hair. He's described as having a fresh complexion. And these are the sorts of things you're just not going to get in other record types usually. It's because they have been kind of assessed and looked at and studied as they've gone into the service of the police. Prior to joining the police, Alexander McVicker had been a railway goods checker. And he started as a third-class constable and he was stationed at Dors on the south side of Loch Ness. And that was a relatively short posting, because in September 1877 he was transferred to Isle Oronsay, moving then to Dunvegan in 1879 and then Glendale in 1882. We'll let you off, Linda, for forgetting it was Thursday. Okay, so we find Alexander McVicker moving to Glendale and Dunvegan in the 1880s in Skye. Now, anyone who's familiar with the history of Skye or has got an exceptional memory of Learn with Lorna's might see the significance in that date and time, that in 1882 he's in Glendale. Now the crofters who had remained in Skye following the devastation of the Highland clearances faced another crisis in the 1880s when their access to common grazing was denied by landlords. And they were therefore unable to effectively graze their animals, make a living, support themselves, sustain their families, and so on. And this was part of a wider picture of unrest and agitation within the crofting communities. And this culminated in the bloody and violent Battle of the Braes in April 1882, where crofters refused to pay their rents and grazed their animals in defiance on land that they had always been allowed to graze animals on. And there was an unrest in multiple areas across the west and particularly across Skye, and including Glendale. And hundreds of extra police were drafted in to try and quell and calm this situation. And one of those who was involved was Alexander MacVicar. I'm not going to go at all here into the whole story of the Battle of the Braes or the Crofters' War or the agitation. It lasted for some years. It is a very a moment that's had a very lasting impact. But if you are interested in finding out more about that, then there's a brilliant exhibition on our website put together by our Skye and Lachalsh team, and there's also an earlier Learn with Lorna on that as well. But suffice to say, for the purposes of this episode, that the situation was brutal, it was acrimonious, and that many wounds came out of it, both physical and otherwise. And as I say, it's a pivotal moment in Highland history, particularly in the West. And Sheriff Ivory, who was a particularly harsh and severe county sheriff, who history has not judged very kindly, he recommended Alexander MacVicar for a King's Police Medal for his role in this situation. Now, I don't know, but given the fact that MacVicar's staffing record shows that his leave was often spent with his friends in the Long Island, so Lewis, and also his friends in North Uist, I imagine being a police officer in this situation must have been a very difficult situation for him. Nothing more is heard of that proposed medal that MacVicar was suggested for some years, and the records show that he moved to Glenelg in 1885, then to Dors in 1898, and finally to Drumnadrochit in 1904. And it's not until 1919 that we see MacVicar receiving that King's Police Medal that he had been recommended for so long ago. So by this point, those events in Skye that he had been involved with were now over 30 years old. And MacVicar had now served 40 years in the police force, and also had served through the First World War. And a contemporary newspaper report records when he was awarded his medal in 1919. And it says, King's Police Medal for Inverness-shire Constable. In the New Year's list of honours, the King's Police Medal has been awarded to Constable Alexander MacVicar, Drumnadrochit, for loyal and meritorious service. Constable MacVicar, who has had 41 years' service in the Inverness-shire Constabulary, has proved himself a conscientious and reliable officer. He distinguished himself in the agrarian troubles in Skye from 1882 to 1885. He was stationed at Glendale, where the disaffection was very pronounced, and the zealous and faithful manner in which he discharged his trying duties won for him the commendation of the late Sheriff Ivory. So I believe, and maybe Dave Connor or somebody else might be able to correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe he was the first, or certainly one of the first, constables of that rank ever to receive the King's Police Award. But it's just an interesting story of some of the big players at that point. Sheriff Ivory, as I say, certainly a notorious name now, and the role of the police in that very, very heated situation. Alexander MacVicar eventually retired on the 25th of October 1921 after nearly 45 years' service. And this is what I was saying at the beginning. It's interesting to note that despite that extract from Scan that talks about that huge high turnover in police forces, that I found many, many police officers with long service records as I was flicking through all of our registers for the different counties. Alexander Will joined the Sutherlandshire Constabulary on the 30th of September 1880. He was 27 years old. He was 5'10½", had hazel eyes and brown hair, and was a native of New Pitsligo in Aberdeenshire. He was a farm servant to trade, and he had also served 6 months in the Aberdeen County Police. Now, whatever the reason for his short tenure with Aberdeenshire Police, that's 6 months, he stayed much longer with the Sutherland Force. He served in Bonar Bridge, in Helmsdale, Brora, and then back to Bonar Bridge. He was promoted from 4th class to 3rd class to 2nd class to 1st class constable before retiring on a pension on the 31st of May 1915 at the age of 65 after 34 years' service. And I was interested to see on the Northern Constabulary Museum Facebook page, which I would recommend if you're interested in this subject, all sorts of stories, that he was replaced when he retired by his son, Alexander Will, as well, who had previously trained in the Edinburgh City Police. It's interesting that Alexander Will stayed so long in Sutherland. He spent that short stint of 6 months in Aberdeenshire Police and then spent those 34 years in Sutherland. And I found a similar thing with Sinclair Tate, who joined the Inverness-shire Constabulary in 1883. He'd previously resigned after 2 1/3 years in the Glasgow City Police and 1 year with the Singapore Police. And he was going to stay with Inverness-shire for the next 30 years. And the last 3 of his service were spent in Benbecula. And I just thought how extraordinary to spend the last 3 years of a 30-year police career in Benbecula, and you'd also served in the Singapore Police. I think that's quite in the 1880s. That's quite a substantial change to see. He retired in November 1913, just not long before the world was about to be completely turned upside down by the First World War, and the police given all sorts of additional extra duties. If we come to look at somebody else, Donald Fraser joined the Inverness-shire Constabulary in 1868 at the age of 25, and he would serve in Dors, Stratherick, Urquhart and Invergarry after over 40 years of service. James Esson was appointed as a constable in Dornoch on the 1st of March 1882. He was 30, he'd already served 5 years with the Sutherland Constabulary and a year and 8 months with the Elginshire Police. And again, he worked his way up through the ranks to become first-class constable, going from Dornoch to Rosehall, to Bettyhill, to Tongue, to Golspie, retiring in 1916 after 39 years. So I certainly came across a lot of people who had put in years and years and years of service. So it'd be interesting to compare that to other forces who reference that very high turnover rate. So we had some very long-serving officers who knew their communities very well. And also, interestingly, that reference to Glasgow recruiting from Highlands and Islands and from Ireland, I found a lot of people within our forces who were local to the area. Once you have someone's personnel record, you can then pursue their story through other policing records and other records. So if, for instance, you can then look at the daily occurrence books that they kept as part of their duties. And if you're lucky, you can then follow them from station to station. So you're not only finding out about, the dates that they've been transferred or appointed, things like that, and that physical description, but also you might be able to go to that relevant police station's log and see what was happening to them day to day. Now, the logbooks are very unlikely to contain any personal details because they are entirely about the day-to-day running, functioning, delivery of a police service. But what they will do is give you an insight into the sort of work that those police individuals were undertaking. So used in conjunction with the personnel records, you can work out some really fascinating bits of information. So for instance, if we take Alexander Murray as an example, there's loads of Alexanders, sorry. Although if you were at my talk at the Folk Museum the other day, there's not as many as there were John Macphersons in that talk. So if we take Alexander Murray as an example, he was 24 when he joined the Inverness-shire Constabulary in October 1900. He was married. He is described as 5'9" 3/4" with dark hair and brown eyes, and he was a native of Rogart in Sutherland. And he was initially stationed in Inverness. On joining the force, his previous occupation is described as coachman gardener, which is interesting. So he joined in 1900. In May 1901, Alexander Murray was transferred to Fort William, and in our Lochaber Archive Centre we have the daily occurrence books for his time there. So we can see his handwriting, we can see his record of his days, but we can also learn what he was up to. So for instance, we can see that on August the 11th, 1901, he set out from Fort William Station to patrol the suburbs of Fort William and watch for suspicious persons, especially anyone stealing hens. Now, it might sound like I'm being light-hearted there, kind of smiling at the thought that our police today would have time to walk about and look for people stealing hens. So it might sound a little bit light-hearted. But if we take that record of his daily occurrence book and then cross-reference it with his personnel record to see what's happening what, you know, his transfers, his annual leave and things like that. We can see that he was dealing with much more than just moving from Inverness to Fort William and looking for hens, people stealing hens. We can also see that he was dealing with other pressures and situations. So that's 1901, that he is moving from Inverness to Fort William, and that report talks about him watching, patrolling. But if we go to the leaves of absence section of his personnel record, we can see that he took 2 days off in February 1901 to visit a sick sister in Rogart. And then in April of that year, just 2 months later, and 2 weeks before he was moving from station to station to go to Fort William, he had 3 days off to attend his sister's funeral. And he was only 24, so she can't have been much age either, I wouldn't have thought. So these volumes do give an insight not only into his individual's police service, but also into their life outside the force as well. So we can imagine in our own minds what that's like to uproot from one job, move to another job and another place, and at the same time, and that's going southwest, but at the same time you're having to go north because you're visiting your sister who's ill, and then the sister passes away, so there's all the grief associated with that. So you can use these personnel records to determine how various aspects of these police officers' lives were playing out at the same time. His notes also record that in November 1901, again not long after his sister's death, he temporarily resigned from the police to join the 3rd contingent of the Lovat Scouts bound for South Africa in the Boer War. He was reinstated to the force on his return to the UK on the 13th of April 1903. But it just shows that you can see his daily work in the police, his family situation, but also the global situation, the countries at war, and people, particularly men from the Highlands, who have got stalking and land skills, then would be recruited into Lovat Scouts to go and fight in South Africa. So you get a huge amount of information from 1 or 2 sentences. Now, he, as I said, was reinstated onto the force when he returned from South Africa. He then was stationed at Erigi and went on to serve in Foyers and Lagan before dying in Lagan in January 1909 of pulmonary tuberculosis, and he was only 33 when he died. So for such a short life, we've got a physical description. We know that he had travelled all over the Highlands. We know he'd experienced loss and grief. We know that he had travelled to an entire different continent and seen a totally different way of life and a brutal situation as well. So you can find details of family, like that reference to a sister dying. Doesn't give the name, but we now know that this individual had a sister. Or you can find references within the leaves of absence to policemen taking time off to get married or to attend a funeral of a family member. And sometimes you get more than that. So if we take the record of James E.M. Henderson, Henderson was 22 years old, a railway clerk at the Highland Railway, when he joined the Ross and Cromarty Constabulary as a 3rd-class constable on the 14th of January 1902. He served at stations across the county, everywhere from Tain to Stornoway and everywhere in between. And he again worked his way up through the ranks and ended up being a detective sergeant. It was quite unusual to see the word detective at that point. So we can follow his career and his postings through the personnel records. For instance, we can see that in May 1935 he was awarded the King George V Silver Jubilee Medal for long service combined with good character and merit. But we can also see the details of his family listed under a section headed Particulars of Family. So we can see that his wife was called Mary Grant and that she was born on the 27th of November 1886. And within this record, there are 5 daughters listed: Margaret Henderson, Helen Fraser Henderson, Mary Grant Henderson, Elizabeth Henderson, Christine Kathleen Henderson, and all of their ages are listed as well. So you can find out a lot of information about the individual police officers' families. Now, so far I've spoken only about members of the police force who have shown exemplary conduct, who have received King's medals, but of course not everyone was perfect all of the time. And so I'm going to finish with an extract from the misconduct and neglect of duty section, which I haven't referred to yet today. Adam Campbell was a blue-eyed, fair-haired, married 30-year-old salmon fisher when he joined the Inverness-shire Constabulary in 1882. He had previously served 2 years in that force, but he had resigned. And he was stationed first at Strathglass, later at Fort Augustus, and then at Lentran. And for the first few years things went well, and again we can see him being promoted up through the ranks of constable from 3rd to 2nd to 1st. But in 1892 his record starts to show disciplinary problems. So in November 1892 his record says, neglect of duty on the 15th of September 1892, being under the influence of drink and neglecting to search for and follow up David Ingalls, charged with horse stealing from Dell, Stratherick, and who had just passed through Fort Augustus for Invermorrison with the horse, the case having been reported to him. So he's been told that this person has stolen a horse and he's coming his way, but he doesn't react to it. Whereby Ingalls, the thief, was enabled to escape until the 13th of October, so nearly a full month he's on the run, where he was when he was apprehended by Invercarron, Rossshire, when he was apprehended at Invercarron in Rossshire by the Rossshire police. So they're not happy with him because he's missed the chance he hasn't reacted to go and arrest this person because he's been drunk. And that meant that for a month they've been on the run, and not only that, but then another police force takes the credit for the arrest in the end. So because of that, he was fined 10 shillings by the chief constable, and that, as I say, was in 1892. In September 1893 we find this entry. He was found drinking ardent spirits in Duncan Hugh Chisholm's public house in Castle Street, Inverness, on the morning of the 22nd of September 1893, while on special duty under the Chief Constable, Borough Police. Seen to enter the said public house by the Chief Constable, County Police, along with PC Scott of Ballafairy. So, incidentally, that was the weekend of the Northern Meeting, when extra police were often drafted in to kind of support and maintain discipline. So that seems to me to be no coincidence that weekend he should be found drinking in Inverness. So for this occasion he's fined 2 and 6, and he's given a caution and a warning. And it's quite interesting there just to see that when he goes into this pub and starts drinking, he's witnessed by the Chief Constable. It's the Chief Constable who sees it happening, and you think, oh. So he's given a warning and a caution that this had better not happen again. Basically, he's on his final warning. But on May the 20th, 1894, his record shows that he absented himself from duty while drunk, and this resulted in his dismissal from the force. And so far you're seeing this kind of pattern of drinking behaviour, and that's relatively common. If we do find any misconduct, there's often alcohol involved. But you'll remember maybe that I said his first misconduct was November 1892, and there's no record of misconduct before that. And when I looked at the leave of absence section of his record, I saw that in January 1892 he'd taken 4 days off to bury his brother. And you can't help but wonder if the drinking incidents that happened from that year onwards were possibly connected. I don't know, but it's interesting to look across the record and see if that's happening in someone's personal life. Maybe that's a connection to why something then happened in their work life. It is not quite as dramatic as another constable who was forced to resign after multiple drink-related incidents, culminating in him being found lying in his uniform in a stable on the high street of Dingwall, and then adding insult to injury by appearing before the Chief Constable 2 days later, still drunk. He was forced to resign. But I do have to say that for most of these police records, there is little or nothing in the misconduct section, and mostly what you're seeing is people carrying out a relatively routine, systematic, community-based sort of role. So I'm going to stop there, bang on time, which is unusual, but it's because I need to immediately run and give a talk to a Rotary Club at lunchtime. I hope you've enjoyed hearing some stories from the police personnel records. They're really interesting. If you're able to come into any of our 4 offices, then do drop in and start to have a look through our police records. You could just sit and read the stories in them. They're so interesting. So thank you for joining me for this morning's talk. Next week, I'm going to be looking at the Morris Pottinger collection, which is, again, full of stories. That's a collection held in our Nucleus the Caithness Archives. A reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. And the High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there is no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we really, really appreciate that. And I'll look forward to seeing you live again next week, hopefully. So I'll see you next Thursday if I don't see you at all the many events in between. Thank you very much for your comments. They're always really appreciated.